Well, thank you very much for joining me on this video. There was a real estate agent out in Vancouver Island who was listing a property for sale, and it was in an area in Vancouver Island that was known to come under Heritage Conservation Act. And so when she preparation for taking this listing, she called the heritage people and found out, yes, this property came under that provision. Well, she felt that that was going to hinder the marketing of the property, so she elected to not put it on the listing. Her rationale was when somebody was interested, she would make them aware of it at that point. But it was worse than that, because in the form they asked whether or not it was under the heritage, and she checked no, that it was not. So she was purposely misleading the public on the listing. Well, she got an inquiry from a local developer, and the seller instructed her not to tell the developer that it was on the heritage site. The seller felt like it was going to kill the sale, and the seller felt that this person was astute enough that they should be able to look it up for themselves and find out. So it's kind of buyer beware. So she didn't tell them, misleading information on the listing. The deal closed. After the deal closed, the buyer on the property was clearing some brush away. He got a phone call from the heritage people telling him that he could not do even clearing the brush off because it was a protected site. Well, he was planning on developing the property, and it was clear to him that he couldn't go ahead with his plans, put the property back on the market for sale. He'd purchased it for $300,000. He sold it for $200,000 because it was under this heritage protection. So it was investigated by the BC Financial Services Authority, and after their investigation, they fined the real estate agent $60,000, which is a pretty hefty fine, and especially on a purchase price of $300,000 and a secondary price of $200,000. But there's really four things at play here. The first is a material fact. And you remember, a material fact is anything that would affect a buyer or seller's decision to buy or sell, and at what price. And certainly, the market proved that it was a $300,000 value versus a $200,000 value if the person had been aware of the material fact. Now, under normal circumstances, that would not be the listing agent's problem, because the buyer wouldn't be the client, and we have a responsibility, at least here in Ontario, to notify our clients of all material facts. Somebody else's client, it's up to them to discover. So it would have been the agent representing the buyer that had the obligation here, but she was representing the buyer. Remember, she was told by her seller not to tell the buyer this, so she didn't. So it came under this fact of material fact. And then the second thing is a latent defect. Remember, latent defect is a hidden defect. And any hidden defect, usually something that goes to the root of the property structurally, has to be disclosed if it's known. And so if it was not readily discernible, now you could argue, well, the person could make a phone call and find out, but that wasn't what the financial authority deemed was necessary. They deemed that it was a latent defect, and they had an obligation to disclose it. So they stated appropriate disclosure of material latent defects must be made. And so they felt that it was a latent defect. Sometimes it's tough, and we'll talk about this in a minute, sometimes it's tough to differentiate between a latent defect and a patent defect. You know, what is readily observable, what needs to be disclosed? The third thing is this issue of active concealment. Even if it's not a latent defect, you can't actively try to conceal it. And the fact that on the listing she put no to whether or not it was a heritage site, that's active concealment. And even if it's, I mentioned before, a large kitchen counter with a pot holder just kind of looked like it was just thrown on the counter, but it was actually covering a huge burn on the counter, that's active concealment. And of course, you're liable as an agent, you're liable as a seller if you know about it and you're actively trying to hide it. And we've seen this before with people, you know, have got problems in a crack in a foundation or water leakage, and they drywall on the inside and parge on the outside deliberately to try and hide it. That's active concealment. And then the fourth thing that comes into play here is the seller's lawful instruction. We have an obligation under agency law to follow the lawful instructions of our principal. And if the seller says don't tell the buyer, then maybe you have an obligation to not tell the buyer. Well, that's not the case because it's not a lawful instruction. And the financial authority in BC stated this: where a client has instructed an agent to act outside the rules, the agent is required to refuse to continue providing service to that client. So when the client tells you not to do a certain thing or to do a certain thing and it's contrary to law, you have to explain you can't do it, and if they won't back down, then you have to walk away from the transaction. Now, let me just leave one more thing here. It's a tough balancing act for realtors between latent defect and patent defect. A patent defect is buyer beware. And if I disclose things that I'll call patent defects, it can negatively affect the sale. But if I don't disclose things that are latent defects, then both myself and the seller are open for litigation. There's some things that can hurt the client. I used to sell a lot of country property, 100-acre farms and so on, and most of those farmhouses, in one or two of the bedrooms, or maybe all of the bedrooms, had no closets. Back in the day, they used to use armoires. And I wouldn't put on the listing, please note, no closets. Sometimes these farmhouses are right in the middle of 100 acres, and in July and August it looked lovely. But I was there showing them in January sometimes too, and you had this huge laneway and maybe socked in with snow. I remember walking through one that was an abandoned farmhouse, and I was walking through it and the snow was right up to my chest, and I was trying to blaze a trail because the couple wanted to see that farmhouse. There was nothing colder than getting into a cold abandoned house when you're freezing cold to start with. These people were transferring down from the Yukon. I showed them the house and they said, we've never been so cold in our life. Well, if you had that listing and it's in the spring, summer, fall, you wouldn't put on the listing, please note, long driveway, socks in with snow in the winter. You better have a commercial snowblower or tractor with a plow. You wouldn't say that. That would be pointing out something that would be a patent defect, if you want to call it a defect at all. Some things you don't want to know. You've got vermiculite in the attic, and you've never tested it. Has it got asbestos? I don't know. But if I find out, I've got to disclose it. And of course, that's one of the problems when a buyer does an examination with property with an inspector, and they go through, and if they go ahead and do an analysis of this and find out that it's got asbestos, you've got an obligation now to disclose that to any future buyers. Similarly, if it's a rental property and they bring in people to check and see if it's fire retrofitted, once you know it's not, you've got an obligation to disclose. So you've got to disclose latent defects. I always like to think that eventually there's some of these gray areas, like somebody died in the property or one thing. I always like to say that eventually the buyer is going to find out, and the buyer's not going to be happy if he feels it was deliberately withheld from him. I think there's a right price for every property when everything's known and upfront. So when it's something that's a gray area, I think you should err on the side of caution and you disclose that. But be very, very careful about these issues. There's a lesson to be learned here, and we as realtors need to protect the best interests of our seller, but by the same token, be sure that we're abiding by the law. Thank you very much for joining me in this video. I'll talk to you again next week.